Oh, I beat you to it.
Oh, okay, go.
Thank you. I think it's
No problem.
recording.
It says that we are recorded, yes.
All right, great. So let's share the screen and let's get going. I hope this is the right one. Nope, it's not. Let me close it. Let's try this again. Take a quick look. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to do a quick review so that everyone can be on the same page. So what started this conversation? And the answer is that February is JDAM, which stands for Jewish Disability and Inclusion Month. And I'm very sensitive to those factors. I try to be. And I saw this and it was really unique. I'd never seen this before until I started doing research for this class. What you see on the left are bathroom signs in Israel now. So what's interesting, it's in Hebrew. Sherutim means facilities. WC is an old British abbreviation for water closet. But here what you can see is handicapped, an icon for a woman, an icon for a man. And this, if you look closely, is half man, half woman, saying that they're non-gender handicapped bathrooms. So it is very accurate. Israel is really pretty much advancing on the idea of inclusion. You should know though, and I mentioned this last week, 30, 40 years ago, in Israel, there were non-gender bathrooms, non-gender specific bathrooms. What happened would, it wasn't feasible to have, 10 bathrooms on the men's side and 10 toilets on the men's side and 10 toilets on the women's side, plus 5 urinals, etc. So what in Israel, I remember when I was a teenager, and we didn't even think twice about it. There was one room that had like 12 sinks, and behind the sinks would be 12 doors that you would go in and close the door, and everyone would have a private toilet. And forgive me for talking very specific, but the whole idea was they were non-gender specific. And when you walked out and washed your hands, being Israel, it wasn't considered inappropriate. You were just washing your hands in front of other, men and women. So the idea of non-gender bathrooms has actually existed in Israel many, many years ago. But this is, one of my motivation was that I started, studying and catching up on interesting discussions in the Jewish world in the month of February. But what really made me decide was so I'll just jump to what you see here. There was by Yivra Elokim, this is the very beginning of Genesis, and this is exactly what Sarita asked about. And God created V'yivra Elokim et Adam, and God created humanity, B'Tselmo, in His image. B'Tselmo Elokim bara oto, and God created him Zachar Nekeva, male and female. Bara otam, He created them. So you would see that if you look really closely and do a close reading of the Hebrew, it really does say that the first man, capital M, was created male, female. A male female is what's called a hermaphrodite. So here is from Psalms, Rabbi Yirmiyahu, Ben Elazar made a comment about Psalms. Adam was first created with 2 faces, one male and the other female, as it is stated. You have formed me from behind and in front and laid your hand upon me. So he used that verse from Psalms to substantiate this Talmudic discussion that the first creation, the first man with a capital M, was a hermaphrodite. In the Talmud, there's actually 8 genders. Obviously, number 1 and number 2 is male and female, the normative, and it actually, that's not exactly politically correct to say normative, but let's say what they call now is cis, CIS, which means, yeah, that's what is accepted as, a vast majority of gender assignments. You have the first 2 is Zachar Nekeva, male and female. Then the Talmud discusses an additional 6 genders. There's an androgynous, which means having both male and female, tumtum, which means lacking any sexual characteristics. Elonit Chama, which identifies a female at birth, but later develops male characteristics. And Elonit Adam, identified female at birth, but later developing, I'm sorry, is it redundant? The other way around, developing female. Saris Chama, identified male at birth, but later naturally developing female characteristics. And Saris Adam, identified male at birth, and later developing female characteristics, but through human intervention. And on the right, you have again the explanation regarding genetic hermaphrodism, things that are called, for example, there's the XXY syndrome, SRY gene, there's the 46XX, there's 46XY, there's all these different.
So it really is important that you take a really good look.
I'm going to have to mute everyone.
I just muted them.
Oh, thank you. So these are just examples of the different chromosomes that make a person non-gender specific. A normal embryo has XY, a normal female embryo has XX, and then you have these Klinefelter's syndromes that a person has an extra X chromosome and it manifests itself in a secondary gender characteristic. So the other thing that motivated me was why we're discussing this is because DaFiomi, approximately 10 days ago, I was studying the Daf and it discussed Hakol chayavim b'ri'ah chutz mechereshot v'avadim sheinam. Okay, so the whole point is the Hebrew got messed up. It frequently happens when I change the formatting. So basically, it's discussing a holiday obligation. It says in the Torah, 3 times a year, all the men, all males, zechurcha, all the males have to appear in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and bring a karban chagiga, a holiday sacrifice. You have to come on Sukkot, you have to come on Passover, and you have to come on Shavuot. So these people are exempted. Who's exempted? A deaf mute, an imbecile, a minor, a tumtum, hermaphrodite, women, slaves who are not emancipated, lame and blind and sick and the old, and anyone who's unable to ascend to Jerusalem on his own legs. Regardless of how politically correct the Mishnah is, it was just like, hey, you know how there are women? Yeah. You know how there are slaves? Yeah. You know how the people who aren't emancipated? Yeah. You know how there are blind people and sick people and and they can't get into Jerusalem because it's too hard, too difficult? Well, there was also a tumtum and a hermaphrodite. They were just part of society, just like any of the other people were identified. They weren't, and the disgusting, there are no adjectives involved. They were just a grouping of, just like the other grouping. Each one had their role to play and each one of them was accepted. So what's really interesting is that these words appear, androgyny appears 32 times in the Mishnah, 283 times in the Talmud. And they're not being discussed as an abomination or disgusting. They're mostly discussed with legal obligations and how they, what are their mitzvot obligations. So for example, if you read between the lines, let's read it real quickly and you'll see how it could be interpreted as a positive attitude towards people who are gender non-specific. So for example, these are the laws in Mishnah Bikurim, chapter 4, Mishnah 1. An androgynous presenting male is like a man because when he has an impure urogenital discharge, he's treated just like any other man. See that? He can take a wife, but he cannot be taken as a wife. You know why? Because how is he presenting? He's presenting as a man. Well, if you present as a man, then you can't take a wife, but you can marry what? A non-gender specific person who merely appears like it? Yes, this is the Mishnah. When born, their mother counts days of purification like a male child. They cannot be secluded with women who are not his wife. You know what? He's being treated like a man based on his presentation. They must perform all mitzvot of the Torah like men. Okay? So right there, pretty amazing. Their gender is determined by their presentation and by their behavior. What about an androgynous woman that presents as a female? They become
If it walks like a dog and quacks like a dog.
well, right now I think it's barking like a dog. Okay, so you're absolutely correct. That's a good analogy or allegory. Forgive me, or simile. I always forget which one it is. An androgynous presenting like a female is treated like a female. That means if she has a urogenital discharge of bleeding, then guess what? Just like any other woman, she's treated like a woman. She has to go to the mikvah. They may not be. However, I'm going to ask everyone to please make sure that you are muted and don't unmute unless you make sure that you're unmuting yourself won't be disturbing to others. An androgynous female, again, is not allowed to be secluded with men, just like any other woman. She's treated like a woman. They do not marry their brother's wife regarding levirate marriage. So what does that mean? As I'm sure you're familiar with the law, if a woman marries a man and they have no children and the man dies, his closest living relative, male, starting with his brother, is supposed to marry her, have children with her, and then named after the deceased rather than the sperm donor husband. So what's interesting about this is that their halacha is they're treated like they don't marry their brother's wife. That means they don't have the law of levirate marriage because they're treated like a woman. They do not inherit like a son. Okay, well, if you're presenting as a woman, then they're good and the bad. At birth, their mother counts days of impurity as they do for a female. And lastly, they are limited requirements for legal witnesses. And if they had an illicit intercourse, they are disqualified from eating truma just like any other woman. So they're presenting as a woman. They're obviously having halacha like a woman. The rabbis recognized that some people's sexual characters change with advancing puberty. That
Rabbi,
means
may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Does that mean that if somebody who comes to synagogue, to temple, and if they behave as a woman, or a male, but perceives themselves as a woman, they cannot have an aliyah? They're not considered familiar?
Why don't you wait? Because there's actually, I don't want to say an edict, but there are directions that were published by the modern Orthodox movement and Yeshiva Chavei Torah. We're going to get to that tonight, hopefully, because I'm going much faster than previously. So the rabbis recognize that people's sexuality is fluid. And that is actually a very modern concept, that people's sexuality is fluid. That some people might feel, perhaps a man and a woman get married and 20, 30 years later, they announce that they're gay or they announce that they're bi. That means their sexuality is fluid. It's not so much that they were suppressing their sexuality, but their sexuality has gone through a transition. So that is referred to as an elonit. The person is born with organs identified as female at birth, but later on they develop male characteristics at puberty. The saris is born with male identified organs and later develops features recognized as female. Now, these changes can occur either over time or with human intervention, which a saris literally means a unit. So that means they had surgical intervention. So in the Talmud, the rabbis supposed the elonit and saris to be infertile. They presumed inability to have offspring created legal complications needed to be addressed. And that's why in Mishnah Nida, it says, a woman who's 20 years old and doesn't present secondary sexual characteristics brings proof that she is 20 years old. And from that point forward, she assumes the status of an elonit. If she marries and her husband dies childless, neither chalitza nor levirate marriage is required. So this is an amazing breakthrough. Everyone thinks that the Talmud is so backward and doesn't understand the needs of the. Listen very carefully. Read between the lines. This is an Elonit, a woman that presents eventually, will at the age of 20 presents female, even though she doesn't have those sexual characteristics, but she's allowed to marry, even though she's considered to be infertile. Now, if her husband passes away, his brother doesn't have to marry her. Why? Because the husband married the Elonit, this woman, knowing she couldn't have children. So you know why that's such an important thing? The rabbis permitted her to have a chuppah with a brachas and kiddush, on wine and making 7 blessings. And she's allowed to be intimate, even though her sexuality is known to have not been, male, female in those terms. So it is true that Talmud basically defines gender to be binary, male, female, but the rabbis clearly understood that not everyone fits these categories. But what's amazing is they were allowed to get married, even though their husbands or wives even knew that they weren't going to have children. It's very, very interesting. And it's very, very progressive if you think that this is 2,000 years ago. And we discussed last week, Trembling Before God. I actually watched parts of it on YouTube. I couldn't find the entire movie, but basically it came out in 2001. It was based on, basically it was a documentary about what it's like to be Orthodox and come out of the closet. And 21 years ago, it was very, what's the correct term? Earth-shattering, because it discussed Orthodox people who consider themselves Orthodox, and that we're dealing with the issue of the Torah, and not so much of the Torah as much as their culture and their societies, their ultra-Orthodox world, condemning them as being abominations. Rabbi Steve Greenberg is the first openly gay rabbi, and he wrote and published Wrestling with God and Men, Homosexuality in Jewish Tradition. And he's an amazing person. I think I have a picture of him in a minute. So I did change the order and I removed some of these slides because they were getting a little redundant. So this is what we were talking about. Yeshiva Chovei Torah is an Orthodox yeshiva in the Bronx. And a couple of years ago, it wasn't long, I think it was only 4 years ago, they issued a statement of principles on the place of Jews with a homosexual orientation in our community. So they actually have changed the title. It's no longer homosexual orientation. I think they actually use the word fluid, gender fluid status in our community. So this is the first standards. Embarrassing, harassing, or demeaning someone with homosexual orientation or same-sex attraction is a violation of Torah prohibitions. Regardless of genetic or acquired behavior, people with same-sex attractions must be treated with dignity and respect. We affirm the religious right of those with a homosexual orientation to reject therapeutic approaches they reasonably see as useless or dangerous. So let me just take a break for a second because it's worthy to stop the presentation. In a number of ultra-Orthodox communities in New York and in Israel, there were these reassignment therapeutic BS, I don't know how better, they were horrible. And basically families would force these Orthodox men and women to go to these quote, therapeutic process where they would change their sexual orientation back to hetero. And all it did was cause severe emotional distraught. And it has never been documented to work. And not only does it not work, it really, really is unfair to the people. And these people who are forced to do things have a very, very high rate, continue to have a high rate of even suicide. It's really, really not good. And in a number of states, they've been outlawed, and there have been ongoing arguments because they list themselves as religious, and because they list themselves as like Jewish or Christian, etc. There's an issue about separation of church and state, and that the government can't close them down. But they're very, very they're not good. They're not good, and the people that are forced to attend them, not good. Okay, so that being said, number 4, rabbis must provide responsible and ethical assistance to congregants and clients dealing with these human challenges. We are opposed on ethical and moral grounds to both the outing of individuals who want to remain private and to coercing those who desire to be open about their orientation to keep it hidden. And the rabbis are basically now fomenting an additional series of doctrines for modern Orthodoxy. It will never, I shouldn't say never, there'll be many, many, many years before mainstream Orthodoxy will be as accepting as YCT and the open Orthodox movement. Some additional: Jews with same-sex attraction should be welcomed as full members of synagogues and schools. They should participate and count ritually, be eligible for ritual honors, be treated under the same halachic and hashkafic framework as any other member of the synagogue they join. So as many of you probably know, my son, I mentioned it numerous times during Minions, my son Sam, his wife Ayala, and their 3 children were with us for a week. And Sam is a rabbi, and he is actually a graduate of YCT, and he teaches in a very prestigious Jewish day school in the Bronx in Riverdale, and it's called SAR, the Salanter Akiva Riverdale Academy. And they have currently, right now, 6 students who have expressed that they are trans or homosexual. And the yeshiva allows them to express themselves in any way they want ritually. So for example, if a woman, a young girl, and there is one of the young girls, she stopped wearing, so there is a, being an Orthodox school, there is a dress code. So when she announced that she was no longer identifying as female, she was allowed to wear pants. And she wants to put on tefillin. Well, she puts on tefillin. Regarding allowing her to have an aliyah to the Torah in school minions, it depends on the minion. So what happens if she walks into there are many minions there in junior and senior high school. There are 5 or 6 minions. What happens if you walk into a Sephardi, very strict minion, and they don't accept women aliyot, and they unfortunately might have philosophical differences. So in that minion, she would not be allowed to have an aliyah. But there are other minions that accept her. Based on that Mishnah, she's presenting as female, they're giving her an aliyah. And that, based on this 6th paragraph of the open Orthodox doctrine, they're allowing it. Regarding gender-specific ritual roles such as cantor, the basic criteria is that the entire congregation must be comfortable with that person serving as its representative. Lay and rabbinic leadership in each community should determine eligibility for those offices in line with those principles. So if you have a very open-minded, open Orthodox, that's what they call themselves now, community, then a trans man would be allowed to be the cantor and lead services on Shabbat or even on the holidays, whereas a woman presenting as a woman would not. In the Orthodox world, a woman can't be a cantor. But what they're saying here, if the community is so fine with it, then the community accepts this trans man, then that trans man would be allowed to be the cantor and lead services. But in the Shulchan Aruch, it says that the person must be, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says the person who represents the community in prayer has to be acceptable to the entire community. So for example, if a person is a low-life piece of garbage, convicted felon, and he has a lovely voice, and some people want him and some people don't want him to be the cantor, the answer is he can't be the cantor, because the entire congregation has to accept him to be the cantor. Jews with same-sex attraction should be encouraged to fulfill all other mitzvot to the best of their ability. So for example, just because a person chooses not to have children and enter into a same-sex relationship, that doesn't mean that they're, oh, well, they're breaking this rule, so now they can eat a cheeseburger. No, not at all. Although orthodoxy can grant religious legitimacy to gay marriage, cannot grant religious legitimacy to gay marriage or couplehood, communities should accept and fully embrace adopted or biological children of said couple. So I can tell you definitively in Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, there are a number of gay couples. They get aliyahs to the men get aliyahs to the Torah. And the same-sex women couples, their children are not treated any differently. Jews with exclusively homosexual orientation should not be encouraged or pressured to marry someone of the other gender, as this can lead to great tragedy, unrequited love, shame, dishonesty, and ruined lives. And that in itself is a very important statement. So if you look at this,
Rabbi,
yes.
I have a
Yes.
question. Has the Rabbinate in Israel refused to consider a rabbi or a synagogue who does that as orthodox?
So I don't know about that, but I can tell you that the first 3 rabbis that accepted these doctrines were removed from the conversion list. And there's a conversion list. There's a list of rabbis whose conversions are accepted as Orthodox in Israel. And what happened was when Israel made that announcement, when the Israeli Rabbinate made that announcement that these rabbis, their conversions will no longer be accepted because of this attitude, there was a interesting backlash about an additional 12 rabbis who started screaming, yelling, "How come I'm not on that list? I want to be on that list. I accept this." You know, they were being facetious. They were trying to be funny. That there are a lot more than just 3 Orthodox rabbis that accept these guidelines. But regardless, in Israel, I think it was, I know it was Mark Twain, and I think he said it either about Philadelphia or about Cleveland. He said, when I die, I want to die there because everything happens 20 years later. So regardless, what I think is it's coming to Israel. There will be eventually Orthodox rabbis in Israel that accept these guidelines, but it's going to be a long time in coming. So perhaps you remember about 4 years ago, there was a member of the Haredi political party, and he went to his nephew's gay wedding in Jerusalem. Yep. His gay nephew married a gay man. They made up their own ritual. I don't know who officiated, but this Haredi rabbi went. He loves his nephew, and he went. He wasn't under the chuppah, he didn't do a bracha, he was not the officiant, but he loves his nephew, and he went, and he stayed. I don't think he danced because it was mixed dancing, but he went. And they kicked him out of the party. He lost his position on the list, and he lost his day job as well. And he said, you know what? I understand why they did that, and I don't care. And I would not have done it any differently. So there are Haredi rabbis who understand the pain and the difficulty of these situations, and they're being slowly. I think ideas are changing, but it's slow. It's very slow. So getting back, I hope I answered that question. You see in this picture, Jewish, Orthodox, gay, you are not alone. So there's a number of gay alliance organizations that are reaching out to help people leave restrictive lifestyles in the Orthodox community because they are gay. We'll get to them too. So it's called conversion therapy. So what are some of the positive changes in the Orthodox world? Reparative or conversion therapy refers to the effort to cure gays of same-sex attraction through extensive, questionable, I don't consider them therapeutic methods. The American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, they all have condemned these, not just as ineffective, but they really are potentially very dangerous. Ultra-Orthodox movements insist such programs, homosexual impulses can be modified. It is just the opposite. They've never been proven to be able to, convert people to an alternative sexual orientation. And all it does is create infinitely more problems. Very positive changes. In 2012, the Rabbinical Council of America, it's called the RCA. That is like the black hat world. They publicly withdrew their endorsement of reparative therapy because there was so many people whose outcome after being exposed to these unbelievably horrible processes were, they finally withdrew endorsement. So here are three Orthodox groups that help gays in the Orthodox world. The first one is called Eshel, and it was established in 2010. They foster more, they're very successful. There's approximately 3,500 people who are members of either Eshel or the Chavruta, which was established in 2007. That's in Israel. And it's, they have a website, they have meetings, they have group activities, they network for synagogues, for rituals, for conversion of genetic children or adopted children, and how to get them converted if there are halachic issues. There's also something that my son Sam was telling me is they have a meeting of JQY. What do you call it? Like Jewish queer youth in my son's yeshiva. There's JQY where he teaches. It was founded in 2001, an advocacy group for teens, and we're going through these problems. And they have this group in SAR. There's 6 students, as we mentioned, there right now, but there's a number of the students who have graduated as well. So that being said, this is Rabbi Steve Greenberg, and he was the first one who openly became known as an Orthodox person who is gay and refused to give up his defining himself as Orthodox. So the famous issue is from Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence. Another English translation is it's an abomination. Regardless, Rabbi Greenberg was innovative in the explanation of how he feels that he is Orthodox and he is gay and that he is not breaking this law. The verse refers only to one act in which heterosexual intimacy is imitated by one partner. There are no mentions of any other acts of intimacy prohibited between consenting men. The verse prohibits, this is what he said, prohibits sex between men that is designed to force dominance and mastery of the penetrator. Sex for the conquest, for shoring up the ego, for self-aggrandizement, or worse, for the perverse pleasure of demeaning another man. That's what is forbidden. The verse is about forbidding sexual domination and appropriation. So what Rabbi Greenberg is saying that first, I don't want to get into it. We're all, and yet I do not hesitate to explain it, and I'm about to. If you have a sensitive disposition towards this, I understand, but I'm going to get very specific. There is no doubt and the Talmud, the rabbis discuss it, that the only sexual act, homosexual act, that is forbidden is a man penetrating another man. That is the only act that is outright forbidden by Jewish law. And again,
And wearing the clothes of women.
but homosexual men may not be don't necessarily identify as a woman. There are men who feel like men who just are attractive to men. But you might have a heterosexual man that wears women's clothing. That's a completely different discussion. And that is not one having to do with gender as much as this particular halacha in this particular verse. I see that Abe has raised his hand. Let me stop the share because I've got so much going on that. Abe, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I think I am unmuted.
Okay, please.
Rabbi, you had mentioned the movie Trembling with God, and I had seen it in the theater when it came out. And I wish that you could, in fact, track it down, because one of the main characters was so concerned about doing wrong that he went to Israel and spoke to a scholar on the subject matter of what he is or is not allowed to do. And basically, the wise rabbi said to him, if it does not break this specific rule, other things that you are telling me that you want to do with your male partner are not in violation of halachic law. They're just not mentioned. I've never even heard of some of these things, but that's not what the violation is.
That's correct. You're absolutely correct. And what is forbidden, and if you study Rabbi Greenberg's halachic explanation very specifically, there is evidence that the halacha really is talking about a violent act perpetrated by men against men. So for example, a lot of the words and verbiage is very similar to what happens, the laws about how to treat prisoners. And we're actually going to discuss that right now in the next few slides. But you're absolutely correct. The only act that is forbidden is a male penetrating another man, and because this verse is talking about with violence, and we're going to explain that in a minute. So regardless, if from one, my son Sam, is I don't want to say he's an authority, but his yeshiva absolutely prepared him infinitely better than I was ever prepared. And in his yeshiva, they actually had gay Orthodox men come and speak to him. And one of the things he shared with me regarding this, and you're going to see a lot of the things that he shared that I reference material tonight. One of the most amazing thing is like 99.9% of gay men do not practice that form of intimacy. It is a vast, vast, vast majority of men and women do not participate in that form of intimacy. Yes, Ahula?
Well, it's a little confusing, because if it's okay for a male to say, I feel that I'm a woman and I want to be a woman, whatever, then if they go into marriage like that, then what's the limitation there?
So here's the interesting thing. First of all, everyone now has heard LGBTQT cis. And the answer is that there probably are even more than 8 genders. There really probably are, and everything in between. And there's even like something called intergender now, that they're finding that people are like, I don't want to use any term that God forbid would be considered insulting, but like they transition. They might feel male, they might feel female, they might be attracted to a male, they may not be attracted to a male. That there's some people whose sexuality is very, very, very fluid, and we're going to discuss that in a few minutes as well. So let me get back to the share. Oh, I know what I wanted to, Abe, you reminded of me something that when Steve Greenberg was in yeshiva, he went to Rabbi Eliashiv and explained to him about his same-sex attraction. And the rabbi said to him, so you're attracted to both men and women? You know, because at that time he thought he was. And he said, and you have twice as much love. Oh my goodness, be very careful. That's a very powerful weapon. You know, he thought that he was going to be condemned. And in actuality, the rabbi said, you have the capacity of loving twice as much. So, you know, before we start this whole, by the way, a lot of times people think because of my background that I'm homophobic and that but here you can see, and most of this I was aware of, you know, for many, many years. But let's get back to the actual text.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask you something? So does it mean that if a person is gay, does it mean that if it is a consensus
Consensual,
relationship,
consensual.
consensual relation, it's okay, but if it is forced, then it's not okay? Is that what it means? When
So
you say violent,
there's no Orthodox rabbi or classic Orthodox rabbi that's going to tell you it's okay. But what if an Orthodox rabbi really is going to be true to himself and true to the text and true to the rabbinic explanations, then they will tell you that there's only one almost male on, by the way, lesbianism is definitely not forbidden according to the Torah. There are issues rabbinically. Now, remember, there's the Bible, which was given by God at Mount Sinai and all of those laws. And then there are a bunch of rabbinic laws that came thousands of years later. Don't compare rabbinic law to biblical law.
Right.
In the Bible, lesbianism is not forbidden. Just a little footnote. Rabbinically, if you want to be honest and true, rabbinically, lesbianism is, don't do that, come on.
Mhm.
But it's not forbidden either. But getting more specific to your question, if an Orthodox rabbi wants to be true to the text and true to the rabbinic discussions and conclusions, then a loving, nurturing relationship between a man and a man that does not involve anal sex is not going to be halakhically condemned, if you want to be honest about it. According to the
So
Talmud.
where does it come in the part that you say violent? Where
So,
is violent?
I'll show you in a minute, okay?
Okay.
We're going to get to that. So this is what Dr. Rabbi Steve Greenberg says. The verse prohibits sex between men that is designed to force dominance and mastery over the perpetrator. The verse is about forbidding sexual domination and inappropriate force. So here I wanted to share with you, this is directly from the Talmud, Yavama 64b. Amar Rabbi Amai Avram Basara Tum Hayush Nemar Habitu El Tzur Chatzubatam Val Mukaved Bor Dukumar Chtiv Habitu El Avraham Avichem Val Sarah Tochalechem. So Rabbi Ami said, Abraham and Sarah were originally tumtumim, people whose sexual organs are undefined and not functional. As it is stated by the prophet Isaiah, look to the rock from where you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit from where you were fashioned. Look to Abraham and your father and Sarah who bore you. So basically, the rabbis offer this indicates that sexual organs were fashioned for them, hewn and fashioned by God, years after society would have designated their gender identity. This is right out of the Gemara. The Gemara is basically discussing, can you imagine? Now, here's the discussion points. According to this Talmudic discourse, the founders of the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, Avram and Sarah were, perchance, by modern definition, gender non-specific. That's what he says it right there. Rav Ami was not considered guilty of Lashon Hara or blasphemy for offering this idea that Avram and Sarah were originally non-binary. It's very interesting. That
So
this
maybe,
Rav Ami was a definitive, one of the great Amoraim, and he started this conversation. Avram and Sarah were not binary. They weren't male, female.
so maybe that's why they didn't have a child.
Exactly. That's exactly why. And that's why Isaiah said later on, God basically performed gender assignment surgery. And that's what, you know what, I was hoping that you read between the lines. The rock is a tzur, right? A tzur is a strong phallic symbol. The rock, look at the rock from where you are hewn. And the whole of the pit is a vaginal womb imagery. And that's why it says that look to Avram, your father, and Sarah, that God changed them. And that's how they got pregnant. And that's what Rav Ami is saying right here, that God basically performed gender assignment surgery that successfully made them being able to be, but what do you learn? What was my point here? That they were gender fluid. They were male, they were female, they were tumtum, they were androgynous. Then they became gender specific later on in life. There was gender fluidity.
Rabbi,
Yes.
but Abraham had
Right?
children with other people.
Had a child with Hagar, right? Yeah, Ishmael.
Hagar, and then with another one as well.
Right? That makes it even more interesting, doesn't it? That here he was, that he acted like he had a male-female relationship that that brought a progeny with Hagar, but with Sarah, he had some other type of relationship. Pretty interesting. So what does Rab Nachman continue? Rab Nachman says the Rabbi Bar Avua said, our mother Sarah was initially a sexually underdeveloped woman, an Elonit, as it is stated, and Sarah was barren. She had no child. So he's basically emphasizing, obviously she had no child, she was barren. The superfluous words, she had no child, indicate that she did not have a place, a womb, a uterus for a child. So according to this Talmudic discourse, our matrix Sarah was perchance, by modern definition, gender non-specific. Perchance as well, she might have been the first person who underwent gender assignment surgery. You know, talking theologically speaking, so that she conceive and bear a child.
Rabbi,
Yes.
wasn't Sarah actually supposed to have been very beautiful, that even that this king took her into the harem for him, and then because Abraham had lied that it was his sister, so if she was not gender specific, how could she have been so beautiful and to make her so attractive that this king wanted her so bad?
So there's actually a discussion about this regarding Purim and Esther. It says that Esther did not look like any other women. In fact, you know what it says? She had a green tint to her skin. So it says olive color. So like when we say olive color, we mean Mediterranean, right?
Right.
No, they really meant she had a green tinge to her skin. And
She
then
was
Achashverosh was like, oh my God, look at, she's amazing. So Sarah was unique in her beauty. Just because a person doesn't have feminine secondary
Attributes.
physical, like she doesn't have breasts, what you know, by the way, I'll give you an example. Do you remember in the early 1960s or late 60s, there was a model by the name of Twiggy?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, she looked like a 12-year-old boy, but everyone thought that she was extremely attractive. So society, you know, it's up and down, it's up and down. There is, you know, if you think about it, just like 12, 15 years ago, women had, you know, were still 38, 24, 38. But that now, you know, there are women who have these horrible surgeries called the Brazilian butt lift.
Right.
where these women want to have extremely large lower waists. I don't know how else to explain it, because now a large tush is sensual. 15 years ago, it wasn't. So like society changes what is beautiful. So the idea that you must understand is that Esther was considered beautiful not because she was had the biggest breasts, or she had the biggest or the thinnest waist and then the biggest hips. It's because she really looked different. And that's why Ahasuerus felt that she was so beautiful, because she was unique, she was different. So what happened is, what I think happened with Sarah as an Elamite, and why Pharaoh thought that she was so beautiful, is because, I will tell you, I do, first of all, a little preface. I have absolutely nothing wrong with people having surgeries to improve their appearance. A little disclaimer, none whatsoever. Hey, I weight loss surgery, and not only do I not hide it, I tell everyone. So I have no problems whatsoever with people getting nose jobs, a facelift. I have no problem whatsoever. And by the way, there's a number of tshuvas that not only permit it. You know what happens after some people get like their nose fixed, their ears fixed, their cheeks, whatever? They feel so much better about themselves that they live longer. Their physical health gets better. So that being said, I have to tell you that I was at an event many years ago, and not many years ago, it was 8-9 years ago. It was a federation event, and it was actually in Israel. And there were a group of women sitting together, and they called me over. And one of them was a member of our shul. And there were 5 women, and I said to them, "Are you guys sisters?" And they started laughing hysterically. I mean, they all looked exactly alike. Do you know why they all looked exactly alike?
They had the same doctor. They had the
They
same
all
doctor.
went to the same doctor. Okay, and they were laughing about it. They were all laughing about it. They all were, culturally very attractive, but they all looked exactly alike. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the concept of beauty, sexuality and sensuality changes. It's all culture. Hey, do you remember a Rubens nude? The artist? Extremely voluptuous women, what we would say in Yiddish, zaftig. That was considered beautiful. Skinny little women, feh. Feh. Who wants a skinny little woman? Feh. Want them zaftig. So, okay. And this does all tie into the concept of sexuality and who's attracted to whom. And we have to change our attitudes and stop thinking very limited about what sexuality is. That being said,
But Rabbi, the discussion nowadays is about school and teaching it.
All right, so I'll tell you what, let's finish, and then because I really want to finish this topic tonight so that we can do a different topic next week. And we'll stay and have a conversation because there's only, I think, 3 more slides. This is from Isaiah, assures the sanctity and holiness of righteous non-binary people. So this is what the prophet Yeshayahu said, and this is an exact quote. Ki ko amar Hashem l'sarisim asher yishmeru et shapatotai, v'natati lehem uvacharti b'asher chafatzi mechazikim b'riti. B'veiti, v'mechomatai yad v'shem, tov mibanim ubanot, shem olam eten lo asher lo yikareh. For thus said the Lord, as for the sarisim, that means eunuchs, non-gender specific, people that were either altered by surgical castration or by genetic castration or non-gender specific. The sarisim is a general term, but they keep my Shabbat, who have chosen what I desire and hold fast to my brit, my covenant. I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters, because they can't have children. I will give them an everlasting name which shall not perish. And then a few verses later, what does it say? My house shall be called a house of prayer for all. So basically what Yeshayahu is saying right from the word of God, that not only are these people who are non-gender specific, not only if they're Shomer Shabbos and they accept the Torah, et cetera, then they are, God will make them just as holy, accepts their holiness, and they are just as holy as anyone else. And God will establish them for eternity, just like any other person. And more importantly, this most probably is a text, Beiti, Beit Tfilah L'chol Hamim. My sanctuary, my house must be for all people. Okay, and that occurs right after this verse about the Sirisim, non-gender specific people. We have to allow them into our synagogues. We have to allow them in for everyone. Now here's something, the Sachatoch Chaver Rebbe, he perished in the Holocaust. He said that Isaac was born with a feminine soul. Ooh, what? And it says, Sarah laughed because she understood that her son would have an unusual soul. This is literally what he's saying, based upon the precise language that the angel used. The angel said of Sarah, Sarah will have a son, and not Avram will have a son. From this, Sarah understood that her son would have a feminine soul. The fact that Sarah laughed when she heard the news that Isaac would be born with a feminine soul shows that trans children can and should be a source of joy. Now, this Rebbe said this 80 years ago, before the Holocaust. And it's based on this particular text, which says, and I'm going to give a son like to Sarah. It's going to be a feminine soul, right out of the Torah. And here, one of the great Hasidic Rebbes of pre-Holocaust Europe understood that a person, that Isaac was going to have a feminine soul. Wait, there's more. Rivka, you know the story that Avram sent his servant all the way back to Haran to find a bride for Isaac. And he came with his camels and he said, I'll choose a girl who not only gives me to drink, but also gives my camels to drink. So the word for a young girl is na'ara. The only problem is whenever the word is used, a maiden, a young girl, it's chaser, it's missing the letter hey. And if you take away the letter hey from na'ara, it means a little boy, a young boy. Throughout the Tanakh, the letter hey denotes feminine, without it, male. So for example, how do you say a little boy? Yeled. How do you say a little girl? Yalda. So na'ara is a girl, na'ar is a boy. And in the Torah, if you look here, let me actually annotate it. So if you look here, this is how it appears in the Torah, without the letter hey at the end. The young woman was very beautiful, but it's missing right here a hey. Bereshit says v'hana'ar, in Chavdalet and Chavched it says v'hana'ar v'tarat, and she ran. There's only one problem. It doesn't say na ra. It doesn't have this letter in the Torah. Now, this is even more difficult if we are traditional Jews, because the stricter you are, then you know that every letter in the Torah is there by design. And if a letter is not there, it's also by design. God wrote the Torah through Moses like a stenographer. Moses didn't get to choose what letters were there and what letters were not there. So what's interesting is because it would appear as if, you see what I did here? Each time I wrote woman with the W-O in parentheses, because there are rabbinic commentaries who say that Rivka was also non-gender specific. She ran like a boy. She was taking care of the sheep like a boy. The rabbis asked this question, why was a young girl taking care of the sheep? The answer was she was very masculine. She was a really tough girl. By the way, that's definitely consistent with the way that she is going to act after she marries Isaac. And that also explains why for 20 years she didn't have children, because she didn't start expressing secondary sex characteristics till much later. Now, I just want to talk, I know we're going over, but give me 5 minutes. Jacob was, according to the Sachachover Rebbe, was the child of a father who had a feminine soul and a mother who had lad, na'ar tendencies. Aesop was culturally cisgender. Cisgender means he was what we would call a normal, but I don't like that term anymore. So he liked sports, he liked hunting, he liked field life. He was physically very hairy. That's what it says literally in the Torah. Jacob is culturally gender non-specific. It says Jacob stays at home. Jacob, forgive me for all the typos. Jacob is found cooking when Esau returns from hunting. Jacob is beloved by his mama's boy. He's mommy's favorite. He's home cooking, right? It also says that he was chalak, which means that he didn't have any hair on his body. Hashem doesn't choose the macho normative gender personality child to lead the people of Israel. He chose the young man who was more in touch with his feminine side. Jacob answered his mother, Rebecca, and said, I can't trick my father. My brother is very hairy, and I am very smooth skinned. He didn't have hair on his body, didn't have a beard, didn't have a mustache, didn't have didn't have a hairy back. So the whole idea was, if you look at it very specifically, you see that this can definitively substantiate a lot of our questions about gender in the Torah. So I want to end on this. I mentioned a number of times my son Sam and how helpful he was while he was here. This is actually a friend of Sam. Maayan is a Rebbitzin in Riverdale. Her husband, Ezra, is one of the senior clergy at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. Her husband, her husband is an Orthodox rabbi, and she is one of the Rebbitzins at this Orthodox shul. She came out as trans and non-binary. She's happily married. She loves her husband. She has 3 children. She does not call herself he or she. She uses non-specific pronouns like they and them. Maayan openly discusses her developing, growing, changing relationship with the Orthodox community and the relationship with God. If you want, you can go to her podcast where she openly discusses it. She covers her hair. She wears non-specific gender clothing. She did cut her hair short, but she covers her hair. And it's a very interesting situation where the community has accepted her. So I said to Sam, what happens if she wants to sit on the man's side of the mechitza? Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Right now, she sits on the female side. Is she, Shakespeare said, to thine own self be true. Is she not being true to herself? No, she's non-binary. She doesn't feel like a man. She doesn't feel like a woman. She's non-binary. Binary means like 1, 0 or 1, plus or minus, male or female. She doesn't say that. She's being non-specific. So that being said, I will now, there's a chat already up. I mean, a question, I think, or a statement. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I think Sarita has her hand up.
Rabbi, actually, I have 2 questions. If Isaac had a soul of a girl and Rebecca looked like a lad, maybe they were gay?
So I think what I really want everyone to get out of tonight's lesson is not that Yaakov had that Yitzchak had a female soul, or that Yaakov was, non-gender specific, et cetera, et cetera. What I want you to really get out of tonight's lecture is what our society is going through Ein davar chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. The rabbis were discussing this already 2,000 years ago. And why were they discussing it 2,000 years ago? The answer is because we had the same issues. But if you look really closely at the things I showed you, isn't it amazing how forward thinking they were in many, many ways? To accept them, not to condemn them, to let them get married, let them have a chuppah, let them have make wine and like have a real chuppah, even though they couldn't have children. They knew that they were non-gender specific, but they could marry based on how they presented. So instead of getting caught up in the little details, was he L, was he G, was she Q, was she T, was Rebecca a male child, man child, was Sarah, was she transsexual, transgender? Instead of getting cut up in all those little things, what I really want to emphasize to everyone is that we have to deal with these things, and we have to deal with it in a open, loving, endearing, and sensitive way, just like art we did 2,000 years ago. And on a personal note, and I've said this numerous times, there are a few things that I regret in my rabbinate, and one of them is not being able to resolve the gay issue regarding marriage. One of the reasons why, there are many reasons, there are 3 or 4 reasons, but a lot of people converted with me to Judaism because I am accepted as an Orthodox rabbi in many circles. So if all of a sudden I started doing same-sex marriages, it wouldn't be fair to those people, because their conversions would then be called into authenticity, called into question. So I have to be careful what I say and do so that people are not hurt by what I do, even though I wish there is a way that we could create a halachic acceptance for these ongoing issues. That's my opinion.
Okay, so Rabbi, the process in Israel right now is that they go to a doctor country, they get married over there. It's like a Kohen marrying a divorcee, or but about the same idea, I guess. And then they come back, and then they register as a married couple. Okay, but who marries them out there? It's not a rabbi. And
I can tell you that any rabbi who graduated from JTS, which is the conservative seminary, any rabbi, I shouldn't say any, a vast majority of the rabbis who have graduated from JTS in the last 10 years perform same-sex marriages. I would say 50% of them that graduated in the last 20 years perform same-sex marriages, and have been doing so for a number of years. So I don't know who's doing, Israeli same-sex marriages, but here in America, Reconstructionists, Reform, and a vast majority of conservative rabbis are doing it.
Yeah, the question is, why would they, I know of some couples that are actually live very Orthodox, lives as a couple. But if you're not,
so let me tell you, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think I have the answer for you. So I have a close friend. I don't want to mention his name because we all know him. He's a wonderful, wonderful person. So he was approached by a young man who grew up in his house. Literally, from the age of 6 or 7, he was in his house. I'm not going to say every Shabbos, but was in his house frequently. And the rabbi is very, very close with him. And when he was 35 years old, and he came out when he was 20. When he was 35 years old, he came to the rabbi and said, you're like a father to me, and I really wish there was some way for you to marry me to my husband, because we're both observant. They're not Orthodox. We're both, but very observant. We put on tefillin, we keep kosher, we go to shul on Shabbat, and we really, really would like you to somehow be able to perform our wedding. So he goes, I can do your wedding, I just can't do your chuppah. What? Because you can have you put up a chuppah, you can have a glass of wine, you can have you can write your own ketubah, but we're going to call it a commitment ceremony. I think that's what he called it. Called it commitment ceremony. They had a ketubah, a same-sex ketubah, because the ketubah is very sex, gender specific. You know, they had rings, but he did Hareat Mikudeshet Li Kedat Moshe Israel. With this ring, you're made holy unto me according to the laws of Moses in Israel. You can't say that. So they said other things. They put rings on each other. They said different things. They broke a glass. They had a glass of wine. They made brachot. You know, like Liliana said, it looked like a duck. It quacked like a duck. It sounded like a duck. It smelled like a duck. It tasted like a duck, but it wasn't a duck. All right. Because it wasn't a kosher ketubah. They didn't do they didn't do the same blessings of Kiddushin, but it looked like a chuppah and it was very meaningful. And that's how he, as an old-fashioned conservative rabbi, goes, I didn't perform a chuppah Kiddushin. I didn't make any blessings and take God's name in vain. He didn't say, Hareat Mikudeshet Li Kedat Moshe Israel.
You see.
So that's how he personally worked around it. All right, any other questions on a very difficult topic?
Yeah, I don't think that you answered my question regarding the aliyot.
All right, so ask that again.
So I was asking that if there's somebody a male, and he perceives himself as a woman, is he okay to get an aliyah, or it could be counted for a minyan?
So how's he presenting in the minyan? As a man or as a woman?
As a woman. I mean,
it's not count.
if
So
in
I
his
actually had this question that I asked Rabbi Learfield many, many years ago. There was a man who, I think I discussed this last week. There was a man who was a cross-dresser. And I saw him in public cross-dressing.
We talked about that.
And what happened was he frequently used to come to our shul for financial assistance. And if he was there for Mincha Mariv, I needed him for Minyan, I would count him. But then I saw him in the street dressed as a woman. So I called Rabbi Learfield, and the answer was basically, was he dressed like a woman at Mincha Mariv? So I go, no, of course not. He came into my shul dressed as a man. Well, then you can count him as a man. Now, how does this relate regarding getting an aliyah? Well, if a man is dressed like a woman, no, you don't call him. He doesn't want to be. If he's dressed as a woman, his own emotional state at that point is he's presenting as a woman. So you wouldn't count him in a minyan.
Rabbi.
Aliyah. Anybody else besides Sarita? I'm going to start charging her $10 per question.
Yes, but Rabbi, the first question that
I'll be able to retire.
When the class began about Adam, I just don't, when after Hashem created Eve, was Adam or a whole man?
Yes.
Yes.
So let's back up. In the first story of creation, Adam and Eve were created bara otam, zachar and nekeva. They're male, female, one person. And then God separated them into a male and into a female. This guy was Adam, all male. This woman was all female. But beforehand, they were like this, and God surgically separated them.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi,
I hear a voice.
it's Liliana. Just a comment. It's interesting that an Orthodox rabbi could get to this extent and still be Orthodox, but if he allows men and women to sit together in a synagogue, they can take his Orthodox certificate away.
You know what? There's hey, let's stop the recording. How do we stop the recording? Here, hold on, stop. Are you sure you want to stop recording?